All right, Nic and Matt, we're back. Vogue Academy Talks. We don't have a better name for what we're doing here than that. We'll get something. Oh, I do need to tell you this. So initially, when I was editing last week's, our first one, I came up with a great name for our talks. Vogue-alizing, which Kim, my wife, instantly shot down. She's like, no.
Yeah.
That was like
dad. I have mixed feelings about it.
Yeah, there's like dad jokes, and then there's like way over the edge. I think I was way over in this territory.
That's the goal.
Another one of my great ideas.
A chuckle, you got it. I think it's hilarious.
Thrown in the scrap heap. I was kind of serious too. I thought it was like clever, but better minds shot it down. Anyway, welcome. All right. So this week we are talking about writing. We have a number of courses that are in the pipeline. Obviously, our procrastination course is available now. Our second course on creative problem solving is going to be available pretty soon. I think within a month. The videos are done. We're just working on the platform to make sure it's ready, that it can accommodate the course. And then after that, we have some really exciting courses. One on reading comprehension, which we'll do a talk on that, obviously. Transition to college, possibly one on imposter syndrome, and also one on writing. And as Nic and I were talking about what to talk about this week, we thought writing would be a great one. So anyway, here we are. So Nic, any initial thoughts, or how do we kick this discussion off?
I think for me, the approach for me is to start by thinking deeply about what it is, or what is the topic. So writing, like, you can take a very surface level approach. We write, everybody does that. It's self-evident, and we're going to talk about the blocks to that. But actually, I prefer, and I think it's more powerful to really examine what it means to communicate in print, and start from a deep understanding, not to make this a lecture out of a grad seminar on print. Those do exist, by the way. I've been to some. But at least a starting point, a grounding point there. And I think for us, also along with that, anytime we're expressing or communicating, we're writing in a context where we're evaluated, there's achievement on the line, say a course or at work, then our sense of self, our self-concept and our worth are invoked. And again, so I think that writing in particular seems to evoke that. If you read about professional writers or people's challenges with writing, they're often grounded in one's sense of self. So that writing is hard in itself. It has challenges, but then there's difficulties that arise that have to do maybe with our interiority or internal experience. And we can address all those.
We'll start there, because there's just, I think, drudgery that people experience or anticipate when they're writing. It's just hard. It's hard to communicate. So that's one level. But then you talked about ourself. Now, when you talk to students, is that more just that they're being evaluated? Do you think that's the main concern, and their sense of self is on the line because, am I a good writer? What is this person going to think about me? Is it all that, or is it more? What would you say?
I think it's that. So the context of that we are in, if we're being evaluated, was going to, and compared, which we often are, implicitly or explicitly, then that's going to bring up certain kinds of dynamics of perception of oneself. If we're being evaluated by somebody else, that makes sense. We'd evaluate ourselves, and we would adopt that point of view or perspective on ourselves. And then that, when we're thinking about what we're thinking about and evaluating and judging it as we're trying to communicate something hard, complex to an expert, that's a lot of interior processes to try to manage. So that's what I'm trying to communicate. There's a lot of these levels, and even at the cognitive level, there's a lot going on with writing that is often not fully examined. But in terms of the sense of self, I think it's evoked by that. But I would add another dimension, and so this goes back to my roots in graduate school, where I studied literacy, so reading and writing, and think about language. So language is a way we convey information, but it's also a way we express who we are, our identity. So to the extent that that's made external, and then we're in an evaluative context, it's easy to feel that I am being evaluated. So how we say something does say something about us and who we are. The classic example that was given that conveyed this point to me was by a theorist named James G. And he talked about walking into a biker bar and saying, "My good man, please pour me." And it's that, what does that say about the person asking? The content of requesting a drink at the bar is the same, the propositional content, but how we do it says something about who you are and also your understanding of the situation, but especially something about who you are. And do I want to fit in? Do I not want to fit in? Do I understand this place? So I think that is tacitly always on the line. And I think what we can talk about a bit more, and I think, is also when we read, are we constructing an understanding of that writer, who they are? And I think most people say yes, which again would suggest that other people are doing that to us.
Yeah, I think that's totally true. So what I think what's interesting, because I kind of want to get to, well, what do we do like that?
Yeah.
But there's also the fact, and this ties into our discussion last time about self-awareness, is that a lot of people probably are unaware, really, that it's their self that's on the line when they think about writing. I think they think about the drudgery, like, oh, this is, they open up their word processor, if we even call it that, their whatever they're going to write their paper on or their memo for work, and they're just thinking it's just blank, and now I've got to somehow create something, and they don't think that, well, it's myself that's on the line here, not just the fact that I've got to get something out here on screen, on paper.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah. I think so. I think the task, so I try to make some distinctions. The task has certain demands, but then we may have difficulties or obstacles to doing the task that have nothing to do with the task per se, right? The challenge of processing and understanding or managing the emotions, anxieties that come up in relation to writing are not the same skills of writing. They're evoked by that, and we need actually two sets of skills. One is just to manage these thoughts, these feelings that come up, and then, oh yeah, this is a challenging task. Hope maybe experience this drudgery or something else, and how I approach that task might help me deal with the second order obstacle that I've created. So if I'm on a roll and I'm creating text and I have confidence from previous writing because I've developed skills, then maybe that second level obstacle of anxiety, concern, worry, evaluation actually doesn't arise. Maybe it's positive. Like, I think this is going to be really good because I learned how to write well. So I think they're interrelated. And having coached and worked with lots of people on writing, I see them as deeply connected.
So given that and the way you expressed it, do you find that it has to be individualized? There's like no standard way to help people overcome writer's block or whatever else is preventing them from writing and writing well.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, I think the coaching affords that. So that's how I'm usually doing it. So coaching can be individualized, and that's one of its strengths, but probably so. So I would say this about procrastination, as the dynamics are common, but the way, the internal motivational dynamics can be generalized, and people recognize themselves in the research findings. At the same time, there's certain features that are quite idiosyncratic. So for instance, to the individual. So for instance, how do you construe the task of writing in relation to you? Or what is your self-talk that usually has to be unearthed? I can't give you my self-talk to change your self-talk very effectively because it doesn't evoke the emotions and motivations that your self-talk does. So yes, so the answer is kind of yes and yes.
Right. So there might be people listening to this and they're like, oh my gosh, I struggle with writer's block. Where do I start? Like, how do I overcome it? And we don't know who those people are yet. And we don't have our course yet. So what would you say?
Well, I've done a lot of thinking about this. I've done sessions. Well, first thing I'd say is like I said, I try to start at a very fundamental level. So one is I would start with some of even the language block, I try to use writing blockages just to change the way of thinking. So writer's block sounds to me, and I think it's usually interpreted as something inside the writer, and that they're blocked from doing something. I think writing is hard. It's challenging. It's challenging to clarify and articulate and organize and write persuasively to an audience that you don't sometimes know very well. That is an inherent demand in the task. It's not a problem in you. It's a problem in the task. It's hard to write. So then we locate the problem outside of ourselves. That's something wrong with me. Now that can, again, it can evoke obstacles, emotions that don't help or are problems. But I think it starts by looking at the tasks. And that makes sense?
Yeah, totally.
And then we can think about the task in two big buckets. And this is at the most fundamental level. There's a philosopher of language in mind named John Searle, one of the most important of the 20th century. And he made the point that actually communication, which includes writing, has two distinct intentions. One is the intention to externalize what's internal, our thinking, our motivations. And then the second is actually to convey that to somebody. And I think this distinction is very useful to keep in mind. So in my work with people, I try to make a distinction between writing. So if you make a note on a Post-it, that's writing. But that's not what we mean usually when we think about writing. We think about writing to turn into something. And I would call that composition. So that composition is more formal sounding, right? It's here, you have to adhere to certain genre conventions. It should be cleaned up. It should be accurate. Often style is a consideration there. And so those are actually important. We can pull apart these processes. Those composition is for an audience other than you in a final form. Writing can take all kinds of forms. And I think that lowers expectations, allows us to think and write differently. We can write about the text versus write the text. We can generate ideas and bullet points. There's lots of ways then if we can pull apart these two tasks. And I think about my own experience as a writer. I learned, from the earliest age, the teacher gave you this thing and you started writing the essay in final form. That didn't work in college. I just couldn't do it. But I didn't have another strategy. I wasn't taught another way to do it. So that we can contrast writing and then later composing with the most common, what I might call writing from scratch. You have the prompt and you just start writing your essay from the first word to the end, or the memo or what have you. And so we think of writing as very linear. You have to start in a certain place. A lot of the thinking is done in your head and then you write things down. The research shows this is not useful. It actually creates the blocks. So the way we conceptualize writing is creating some of the blocks. Second, that's not how professional writers write.
Can I ask a question about that?
Yeah.
Because it seems like overall, the strategy is that we have these ways of going about writing that create these blocks. I mean, we make this task overwhelming. So what you're doing in general, right, is to kind of find ways or strategies to minimize anxiety or anything that that makes the wall, the obstacle so high.
That's right.
Right. And then now I forgot my point for that question, so we'll move on. So please proceed.
Well, I tend to start from a cognitive perspective. So I talk about lessening the cognitive load. So I think writing is demanding, and then we can make it harder on ourselves. We can make it overwhelming, right? By how we approach it. So one example I say, like, okay, you're trying to move something that's heavy, a big load of 1,000 pounds of concrete from one side of the road to the other. You can try to lift all 1,000 pounds at once and try to get it across, and then what's that going to involve? And you're going to hurt yourself. Or you could try to tear apart the bag and at 20 pounds a bag, walk it across the road. It seems obvious, but actually in writing, we tend to not do that. Most people write from scratch. So what are they doing? If you break down the cognitive task that leads to overwhelm, they're trying to identify what they want to say. What's the big idea that they want to say? What's the evidence? How are they going to organize it? How are they going to explain things? They're going to choose particular words. Does it sound good? They want to make sure they don't make any mistakes. That's a lot of cognitive load to be making at each word or each sentence as you go. We don't want to be doing those all at once. You want to try to peel off different layers of the writing, cognitive aspect of the writing process, that also have correlates with the self-concept. But especially thinking about when we're thinking about writing to the ultimate audience, I think that invokes the anxiety. So if we, for instance, we say, I'm going to pull apart these different cognitive dimensions of the task, and I'm going to write to me, or I'm going to write so to me and for me. I'm going to write to an audience that I think is much more receptive, or that I want to write to. A lot of times it's the audience that evokes the anxiety. So I know that was for me. So I've had a lot of success coaching people to say, okay, envision an audience that you would want to write this to, your grandmother. So you're writing a paper and you learn this cool thing and you want to tell your little brother about it back at, and they're in high school and you're in college. How would you explain it to them? Now, that's what I call the intermediate audience. So the audience and our conception of them infuses all of our choices. We're imagining how they're going to receive our writing. Are they going to be critically judging us? Are they going to be receptive? What kind of language would I need to use to convince my professor? What's the references and stylistic choices that they're expecting? So if I can change my audience, then a lot of times that lowers the expectations, simplifies the task, and then that's an intermediate step. So I sometimes will think of it as the way you create a draft is by imagining a draft of your ultimate audience. Who's an intermediate audience, much like that you have an intermediate text.
Yeah, that's good. I also and do explore this possibility or this idea that when I was teaching at the university, I would tell students to write to kind of jaded middle school students.
Oh yeah.
Not so much for that. It was more that you can't assume anything. You know, like, because we tend to get like all the jargon in the class and then we're just spitting that out. But if you don't explain it well, it shows that you haven't understood the terms. But that's a different point.
Well, I think that's an issue that is frequently addressed by college writing faculty, and you're trying to think of a method that addresses that, right? So we take a lot for granted when we're writing, when we imagine an audience that's very knowledgeable.
Right. Exactly.
And that can be problematic.
Right.
So that's a next level. So I've been talking pretty abstract.
No, you're right. In a way, as soon as I said that, I'm like, that's kind of a tangential to what you're.
I don't think tangential. I think it's a method.
Right.
And what I was talking before, maybe like a strategy, a more broad.
Right. The strategy for reducing anxiety versus strategy for how do I clearly show that I understand these terms that have been discussed in the class or
Right.
a business term, or for my wife with her work, she used to ask me to edit stuff just because she was often writing for outside audiences, and when she was in the pharmaceutical industry, there's a lot of jargon, and so I was like, what is this term? I don't understand it. And she would like that because that would help her to make sure she was communicating effectively and clearly to outside audiences.
Yeah, so I would take your point to go back to the task of really thinking hard about writing, and then we can specify academic writing. So academic writing, in principle, highly values explicitness.
Mm-hmm.
And the tendency to write someone who already knows a lot would be to be inexplicit, to be, you don't have to explain everything. So if you say, well, let's create an audience that makes you explain everything. Now, that's not so great for fiction, right? So I've heard fiction is the art of what not to say. And I think academic writing is being highly explicit. So that's a great method, I think, what you just described, to force us to meet the genre convention or expectation of explicitness in academic writing.
Right.
And I can say those words, be explicit in academic writing. Okay, how do I translate that into a method that I'm using moment to moment when I'm writing? Oh, let me construct an audience that would require that. And then I'm going to keep them in mind. And my intention is to write to them. Then I would say the difference. So the next step is the composition phase is now how do I I've generated a text. I've been explicit. I've got my ideas out there. I've explained the chain of reasoning. I've made very few assumptions. Then when I think about my ultimate audience, my professor, this particular class, or my boss, or what have you, then I can massage, adjust, adapt to these expectations. But I've got text in mind, and that text has ideas. It may be some beginning of some organization. I've thought through some things. So I'm not doing all these things at once. I'm not doing the stylistic piece, making some fine-grained choices about word choice and prior knowledge of people. I'm not trying to do that while I'm fashioning or molding the overall argument. It's getting out of myself the big ideas and the structure of that. That's when we're trying to do all those things. I believe a good chunk of the obstacles people experience in writing is trying to do all those things at once.
Yeah, I almost want us to repeat that, because I think that's what you're advocating, and your experience from coaching and teaching suggests is that we tend to want to do kind of everything at once. And what both of us have seen is college students who have a paper due, and instead of taking a week or two, whatever amount of time to really work on this and divide up the tasks, they just sit down the night before it's due and try to do everything at once.
Yeah.
And that creates tremendous amount of anxiety and discomfort, and thus makes writing all the more harder the next time, because that's their experience of writing. Mm-hmm. Versus what you're saying is not necessarily to compartmentalize, but to kind of break out the tasks, right? Yeah. To say there is to break out the task, and also that it doesn't have to be linear. You don't necessarily have to start at one, like with this one task. I can't remember how many, you break it into how many tasks do you have, like 5 or 6 or something?
Aspects, yeah, but maybe 6 or 7, yeah.
6 or 7. And so you can start anywhere that's best for you. Correct? That's
exactly right. Yeah. So I think, notice that this conceptualization of writing as a linear thing. You start at the beginning, and you're supposed to know what your thesis is first, and then you make an outline. These are things that are often conveyed to students implicitly through teaching. And starting to, the teacher asking you what your thesis is convenient for them, but is not useful for you. Expert writers write to figure out what their thesis is. They don't figure out their thesis and then write to support it. That is not how empirically we know. So that's not the case. So all the things I'm advocating, actually, if you study expert writers, and people do study expert writers, these are the things they do. So there's a reason for that. It's what makes them experts. It's not that they put aside this idea of writing as linear. They start wherever they can start. They write not just the final text, but they might write, what am I thinking? Why am I thinking that? How would I organize this? And then try to respond to those things. Those answers are to those questions that are guiding the process of writing and composition don't by themselves or per se go into the final text, but they are challenges that a writer has to resolve. So I would say that it's useful to think that the blockages are actually choice points, dilemmas that the writer has to resolve to do the thing they want to do. So it's actually useful to get stuck. You're like, right, I have to decide, who am I writing to? How am I going to say this? What is the most important evidence? Of course, that we have to make those choices. And in fact, if we just automatically write, we'll probably write a less good document, a less good text. So in some ways, you can embrace those dilemmas. You're like, I'm not sure what to do here. That suggests that you haven't conceptualized your task fully, your project, and you would want to do that. That's not a sign that you have some problem in you, right? That's a recognition that writing involves a lot of decisions and a lot of problem solving and a bunch of choices and making choices about strategy for how you're going to communicate. Of course, that's just not going to come out whole cloth. Of course not. So I think that is what I would say. And then we want to have strategies and methods of writing that help us resolve these different kinds of dilemmas and challenges.
Yeah, you make me, as much as I tried to help students with their writing skills, And to make writing more pleasant, and we've discussed this, and I can even talk about my method that I advocated. I think you're absolutely right that I would always drive home the need to get a thesis.
Yeah.
And I to me, that was intended to help students, because once you have a thesis, that kind of clarifies your thoughts. It kind of puts guardrails or parameters around what you need to read and not read. If you know what I mean, you can eliminate stuff, especially for students that, where I used to teach and work at Princeton University, and Nick still works there, you have your senior thesis. So that was meant to be helpful. But to your point, it's not necessarily, it isn't necessarily helpful, because that may not be where students need to start. They need to get there at some point, but
Right.
they might need to, for their own selves, do something else first to get them to that point where they can really come up with a good, tight, accurate, and concise thesis statement.
Yeah, and most people don't have a set of methods to get them to a thesis. It's just
Right.
they just sort of think about it and write it down. So just to be clear, when I was a college student in grad school, I didn't write in the ways that I'm advocating now. I was absolutely a procrastinator. I wrote all at once. I really disliked it. I had one teacher in college who, and I wish I could track her down and say thank you, who helped me have a different kind of experience with writing. But everybody else, it was it was definitely drudgery for the most part. A few exceptions here and there. But I think that you're right in the sense that if you can get to a thesis or controlling idea, it has a lot of benefits to the writing process. And if a student has that and they're happy with it, fantastic. So I always say you only use strategies when you need them.
Right.
Like, if you have a thesis and you want, great, you don't have to not start there. But the challenge is so often is we're artificially pushed to have a thesis. And then we've probably all been experienced like, well, that was my thesis, so I got to write to that.
Right.
And then you're not interested, you don't enjoy it, you don't have much substance, or now you're putting in a bunch of fluff. There's all kinds of things going on there, rather than let me hold this loosely and recognize that writing need not be linear. And that was an initial phase. And what can I salvage from this thing? But what have I learned by writing and thinking that would actually have me change that? And these are questions that I just never examined when I was a student writing. I was just like, okay, that's what I said I was going to do. I'm going to do it. How do I extract 5 pages out of these sources to do that? Those are very practical, kind of surface level questions. They created their own problems and dilemmas. And I just didn't have very many tools to do anything else.
Yeah, I wonder, you were at a point, at least in college, where you could recognize the issue and were open to other methods. I'm curious, with your own teaching and coaching, given that it seems to me so obvious that what your approach is so much better and can actually make writing an enjoyable experience, or more enjoyable than it would be otherwise. How receptive are students and folks?
Good question.
And if they're not, what do you find makes them resistant to this different approach?
Well, I can answer that one right off the bat. It's time. People think that the most efficient way to get to a final text is just to start writing it. That's applicable to all kinds of things. And I think it's just not true, because you're stuck so long and you're sweating it out. So I think, and in the context I'm in, it just feels like I don't have time to be doing these different things, these different steps along the way, or these processes. I think they're receptive when they feel differently. When I say, oh, imagine a different audience. Or I usually say something like, okay, so you're writing this thing. Who would you want for your class, your professor, for your advisor? Who would you want to write this to? So I've had a couple experiences where a student that really led me to think hard about this move as a coach and this move as a writer. The people that really made me think about it had immediate answers. And then I said, okay, how does it feel imagining writing to them. They're like, yeah, it's great. It gives me a purpose. I want to do this. It's okay. Let's write to them first. And so they could kind of see what they had a sense of that these obstacles of writing up to a professor in a particular way and scholarly way that they didn't necessarily value or like or feel very confident, and kind of took them away from maybe why they want to do the project in the first place. So it does require that you have some flexibility, but those things just simply decreased, and then they've had a real purpose for the projects. Like if you don't have a real purpose for the project, that's maybe not as helpful, but and so they could it just sort of rolled out of it. They could just see the pathway. And I think that suggests that there are these obstacles on the one hand that were evoked by the task and who they were writing to. And then that can even block their strategic thinking about writing. When that was gone, they could rely on some methods and things they'd done before.
Yeah, I think your point about time was really accurate as well, because I think we have talked, and the method prior to us really discussing this, my method for students was, I don't know if I told you, called spew and edit.
Yeah.
Where I would say, a week before the paper was due, just open up, the computer and don't even look at the screen, because as soon as you look at the screen, you see the void, and all this anxiety comes up. I said, just start writing, just spew, and then save it, put it away, don't look at it for 24 hours, come back the next day. And I said, now this is the hard edit where you see it's pretty junky, but but prior to that, you have to realize that you've written your paper. So instead of this anxiety that you have because it's the due date's approaching, you've got something to turn in. You might fail because it's terrible, but at least you have something that you can turn in. So that, again, reduces some anxiety. And then the next day, that's a tough one. But again, just open it up, take a look, and just make what I would call block edits, or more content edits. Try to move stuff around and blah, blah, blah. And then again, don't spend too much time, save it, come back the next day. And so you keep doing that, and you keep refining to the point where, along the way, you find little things you missed. The argument doesn't, you make these leaps in logic that you need to fill in the gaps, all this kind of stuff. And then towards the end, you're refining not only what you say, but how you say it. And, if you go through 3, 4, 5 edits, you're going to turn in something so much better. And you've probably taken less time, and it hasn't been nearly as painful as it would have been otherwise. And then my incentive to folks was that if they could get me a rough draft, 2-3 days before it was due, I would meet with them and go over it. So, I would say maybe 25% of the students would, maybe less, honestly, would take me up on it. But I think your point about time was key, because it doesn't necessarily take more time. You just need to start earlier.
Yeah.
And, I think there's that procrastination tendency to say, I'll just push it off until that point where I really need to get started. Well,
it could be too that we have a conception, and I think I had this pretty explicitly, like I'm supposed to figure out what I'm going to write before I start writing.
That's a good point. Yeah.
And that's a way of conceptualizing writing that we want to address explicitly and interrupt and say, no, you don't. And you're doing that in the method, I think. You're trying to overcome a block, which is, start before you feel ready. That can be a little slogan, start before you feel ready, or in entrepreneur work and design, it's a bias toward action. If you can take an action, take an action. Start before you're ready. Another one in writing is the best writing is rewriting. Right? A task started is half complete. So it's once you have a text, once you've externalized, remember that's the first function. That's the first task, is to externalize. If I'm trying to externalize and communicate at the same time, I've made it much harder.
Right.
So if I can externalize, then once it's externalized, then I can do a variety of things. I can edit in various ways. But I even come back to this idea, this conceptualization. If you ask most young people, most students, what's editing, it's word choice and grammar. You said block edit. You have a whole word that probably most people don't even know. The idea of a revision and editing, that you'd move pieces around, that you'd say, oh, this isn't the main point. This is my first subordinate point, but I actually have a larger claim that I'm making. Let me articulate that. And do I want to start with the biggest point or the smallest point? Moving big chunks around. That's a very uncommon move in student writing.
Yeah, well, I just, given my experience in the creative agency world, where we're working with agencies that do copywriting or editing, I should say, there's very different forms of editing. And so when we would reach out and say, hey, we have this book we're working on for this client, they ask, well, what kind of editing do you want? That's an interesting point that most students don't, what do you mean? There's more than, the idea there's more than one type of editing is foreign.
Yeah, I think there's a reluctance, a resistance, and I've experienced this. If I've written it down, I don't want to have to take it out. Like I had to generate that text, both to be efficient and also like that's wasted effort or something, which I get. So I think we talked about a few things that you were saying, the spew and edit methodology and block editing. Right. There is some corresponding language approach in teaching of writing, college writing in particular. There's a focus on it's called the writing process that has different methods. So there's free writing, which is generating ideas. There's rough drafting, outlining. There's post outlining. There's a variety of methods that people can use, and I think your approach is incorporating many of these. One of the things that I try to do then is say, well, what do those methods do at a cognitive level? So the writing process methodology is focused on different ways of working with text. But I'm saying what's going on mentally in your mind, and that's a different level of analysis. And I think if you combine those, then students who've learned things like rough drafting or outlining or post outlining or free writing can use those methods much more effectively, much more purposefully. So sometimes I'll even ask people, what's the difference between free writing and a rough draft? And they're like, I don't know. Well, that means you don't really understand the method. You don't understand if you can't distinguish, because they're actually two different methods. They have two different purposes. You can't distinguish them. So free writing is simply putting out words, whatever's coming to your mind, unedited, completely without a filter, just whatever comes to mind, writing it down. So this is the idea of generating ideas. That is different than generating text.
No, I just want to pause there, because I think you're absolutely right. And it's interesting how over the years, I've actually become more, I've taken up that free writing component and how essential that it has been for my own writing. And in fact, my free writing is actually, I use the speech to text functions in my phone. That helps me a lot. I'll just kind of talk it out and it's generated into text. And that's really, I would consider that free writing. It's still getting my thoughts out. Absolutely. And it's easier because I don't have to, I'm not limited by my typing speed. Well, I just, blurt, spew out these thoughts as I'm reading, if I'm, whatever I'm, researching, be it Kierkegaard or Christian contemplatives or something else. That's really helpful for me, because then I have those and then I can use that material to put it into some article or book or whatever I'm working on. So.
Well, we might even call it idea generation rather than free writing. Okay. So that could be you could be talking, you could draw a mind map, you could do anything that doesn't have to be text. So free writing suggests the text, but it didn't have to be.
Yeah, good point.
It could be a conversation. You're trying to generate ideas. That's the point. So I think there is some value in describing at a cognitive level and generating conceptual content versus free writing is a method to do that.
Okay.
Getting clear about that. Okay, so what is writing your first draft, your rough draft? That's usually the focus there is on organization of ideas. Right, and you're beginning to move toward writing something for an audience, so composing, but in what's the shape or arc or flow of the whole? And that's a kind of decision we're trying to think, how do I make my text and my ideas cohesive and coherent? How do they connect together? What's the flow? What's remove logical gaps? And until I try to do that, I try to put it into some whole, a comprehensive document, then I'm going to not have, there's going to be some gaps in my thinking until I really push myself to do that. But there's other ways to do that. An outline can function that way. Again, a mind map could do that. The main point is you're trying to understand the ultimate text to the ultimate audience as a whole without getting caught up in other things. I'm not focusing on too much content creation because I've already done some of that. I'm not trying to make it stylistically really beautiful. I'm not focusing on removing the errors, right? I'm not zeroing in on word choice. So if I can eliminate those things, then I can think about the structure of the text as a whole and how it flows. And again, the argument would be that if I can pull apart and focus in on one of these aspects of the text and the cognitive processes involved, that's going to be more manageable to me. I'm going to be able to do it better. And I also don't get distracted. How do I spell this word or whatever? And I'm looking it up and now I'm out of my flow. No, right. Focus on the flow. Focus on the organization. Yeah.
That's cool. Well, we've already blown past our kind of half-hour limit. We get rolling. So just before we go, though, do you have any last thoughts? I mean, obviously, as we said, we're working on a course where actually got a fair amount of material already. So we know a writing course will be on the Vogue Academy platform, hopefully fairly soon. But just in this little,
I'd say start with what you want. Just ask yourself, what do I want to say? What do I want to make sure is included in this text? Why is this interesting to me? Start with what you want, what you like about it, and write about it. Then leave the composition to later. So try to start with what you like, what's interesting, what's appealing. If you've got an idea, write it down. It doesn't matter where it's going to fit in the final product. It could be near the end. So what? It's your way in, it's your entry point. Mm-hmm. So getting started is really crucial. The main obstacle to writing is getting started. So having a lot of strategies to get started is crucial.
Great. All right. Well, there we go. Writing. There's so much to talk about writing. So we'll obviously come back and have another discussion about it. But thanks so much, Nic. And till next week.
Yeah, it's fun.
All right. Take care.
Bye-bye.